All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for those that have made it through this long day, and you're still willing to stick around and have more conversations. I know the food probably helps. So thank you to Illinois Farm Bureau and Regala for having me and hosting this panel here. And thank you also to the Savannah Institute, who is joining us. So this panel will also be, it is being live cast to a ongoing series that the Savannah Institute has called Nutshell Discussions. And so we're not going to be able to hear them. There was enough tech to already figure out just to get what's going on here to them. So I'm going to do my best to communicate what they want to you guys, and during the Q&A period, I'll also be fielding some questions for them. But I'll go ahead and read a quick intro from the Savannah Institute. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Savannah Institute. It's a nonprofit organization focused on research and education about agroforestry in the Midwest. I believe we'll have a 101 on agroforestry coming up, but essentially this means working with trees that produce crops which help make farms more profitable, resilient, and healing for the environment. We develop educational resources and host events like field days at farms, all with the aim of helping farmers share what they are learning with each other and more broadly. One of our signature programs is this Nutshell Discussion series. We bring experts in agroforestry, silvopasture, and perennial agriculture to an online forum where they present their own best practices, research findings, tips and tricks of the trade. They occur every Tuesday evening all throughout the year. They are free to anyone, and we hope you'll join us for some beyond tonight's Nutshell. To register for those and everything else you need to know can be found on the Savannah Institute website, which is savannahinstitute.org, and that is Savannah without an H. I get that all the time. People ask if there's an H. There's no H. Savannah Institute. One quick housekeeping for those joining us online. Please use the chat function of the online platform to ask questions to our panelists. Due to tech reasons, I will need to read those questions to our panel here. So, very excited. Everyone can join us. Welcome, everyone. We're getting started. Just a few seconds. Oh, wait, that was her message to the people online. So, I am Tori Dalhoff. I work at the Greater Peoria Economic Development Council. And I will say, to my relationship with the Savannah Institute, I am a board member of the Savannah Institute. I've been involved with that organization since it was first created, sort of a spin-off nonprofit organization of some research that was happening and still is at the University of Illinois. So I wanted to pull this panel together today, coming from the economic development perspective. At the Greater Peoria EDC, I'm really trying to kind of expand the scope of work we do in the Greater Peoria region to really have a more robust conversation about agriculture and the agriculture industry. I think too often we take it for granted, especially at the economic development organization level, of what agriculture, what the industry is. I think we tend to forget about what it could be and will become, and we get stuck in sort of the idea of what it has been for maybe the last, almost a century. And so I'm really looking at, innovation in agriculture, and I think this is, yes, this is ag tech and all of these other innovations, things that we associate with innovation, but I think something as basic as cropping systems and start thinking differently about how we use our land throughout central Illinois and how that can generate business opportunities, especially for farmers. It can possibly excite a new generation of farmers to get on the land if they know that there's something different out there. There's a different way to go about it. So I wanted to pull this panel together today to have a little bit, we went back and forth on this conversation of how many people have been exposed to the concept of agroforestry, so how much should we just do an introduction to the topic, but then also for those that are informed on it a little bit, start to maybe answer a little bit of those questions and concerns with how do you actually do this? How do you scale up these perennial types of systems and incorporate them into our, large-scale agriculture system that we have throughout central Illinois. So I will now let the panel introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Sarah Lovell.
Yeah, is my thing on? You guys hear me? Okay. My name is Sarah Lovell, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois. And my research really focuses on multifunctional landscapes. So looking at areas that provide a lot of different functions beyond just production functions, also thinking about ecological and cultural functions. And so a couple of lines of research that I have, or themes that I have in my research, are agroforestry is definitely one of them. And I'll talk in a little bit about one of the projects that we have going on in that area. And then another topic that I work on that would also probably be of interest to this group is urban agriculture. So that's basically my intro.
Scott?
My name is Scott Williams. I'm here with my sister Sandy. We took 17 acres out of a traditional corn-soybean rotation with a small beef herd operation that we are the owners of, and committed it to a perennial woody polyculture, permaculture, agroforestry, whatever the best current term for it is. Hello. Hello. There I go. Hi. Hello again, but I won't repeat all that. And so in 2015, we took these 14 acres and planted 22,000 food-bearing perennial crops from rhubarb and asparagus to various berries and currants and nut and fruit trees. And we are learning through that experiment. These are planted in rows with alfalfa in the alleys in between. And our farmer mows that alfalfa and keeps the weeds and stuff down, and then feeds the alfalfa to his cattle. But we're trying to do sort of a mimic of the diversity of a natural savanna environment with trees and lower story plants, which is environmentally very diverse, and hybridize that with the corn and soybean rotation monoculture, which produces more food calories per acre than any other system on the planet, but is not environmentally diverse at all. And so trying to provide a hybrid of that kind of with what we're trying at our place.
My name is Nick Paulson. I'm an associate professor at the U of I. I'm in the Agricultural and Consumer Economics department, and my background is very much coming from the traditional commercial agriculture side of things. I grew up on a corn and soybean operation that looks very much like the corn and soybean operations here in Illinois, back in Minnesota. And I would say I've been at the university for 10 years, and I think just in the last 5, a lot of my work in the areas of risk management and agricultural policy, we see a lot more going on at the intersection of kind of traditional agriculture and conservation or environmental economics. And so I've become involved with projects related to agroforestry, cover crop practices, and other things like that that are addressing some of those ecosystem services in conjunction with or in partnership with some of our traditional practices.
I'm Bill Davison. I'm a local food system educator based out of Bloomington Normal here, and I have a couple agroforestry related projects that I work on. I have an urban orchard here in Normal. It's called the Refuge Food Forest, and it's meant to be a demonstration site for agroforestry, so it's about 1.5 acres. It's 4 years old. It has chestnuts, hazelnuts, fruit trees, berries. And so the goal with that project was to get kids outside and to expose people and our future consumers to what we're capable of producing here, and then to try to connect that project to farms in the region. So we have a larger project ongoing in the Middle Mackinac River watershed that's north of here, and we're working on our infrastructure and experience with agroforestry crops. And so I teach propagation workshops in the spring, and we graft fruit trees, and we teach people how to plant and care for chestnut trees, that sort of thing. And we're working up to more extensive variety trial programs. We can get these trees out on farms, learn which ones do the best, and scale it up from there. And the ultimate goal is to try to get to the scale that we can develop a cooperative structure so farmers can share, work together, and build up marketing in that way.
I'm Will Glazik. I'm a second-generation organic farmer from Paxton. I kind of grew up in this local food movement. My parents started Transition in 2002, and they taught me about diversity on the landscape. So we raised diversity of crops as well as livestock. They taught me about conservation and how to value add to what you already have rather than getting bigger. And that's kind of how I got into tree cropping. Is I noticed all of our fence lines and our buffer strips and different areas in between fields. I said, these aren't doing anything for us. Let's do something with it. So let's plant some trees. We got some time. So we're putting in hardwoods, we're putting in windbreaks, we're putting in nut trees and fruit trees. And even if we don't do anything with those for the next 50 years, my grandkids are really going to hate me trying to tear those out. So.
Okay, so real quick, in the spirit of the Savannah Institute nutshell, I'll start with Dr. Lovell. Will you give us the nutshell of what agroforestry is and why we're even talking about it as, what makes this different than, say, backyard permaculture? What makes this different than conservation, right?
Okay. Yeah, so agroforestry, the very simple definition is that it's the combination of trees and shrubs with crops and or livestock. And so that image that you see up on the slide is actually a really good one because it shows a lot of different landscape practices that can incorporate agroforestry. So in the Midwest here, where we see mostly corn and soybeans across the vast landscape, if we do see trees or shrubs integrated into our landscapes, it's typically in the form of a riparian buffer area. So maybe along some of the river zones, we might get into areas where they will plant some trees and shrubs. Another popular practice, somewhat popular in our area, is a windbreak program. And so a windbreak can be even a conservation reserve program type of system where you're just planting trees and shrubs, but it's connected in on the land that used to be agricultural. So, okay.
Sorry, I threw that up real quick.
Okay, yeah, so looking at the different types here, so those are two of them. We also have silvopasture, which is combining pasture systems with livestock and adding trees into those systems. We have forest farming is another type of system. So forest farming basically is starting with the forest, typically, in that concept, and then starting to do production underneath the forest. So it can be mushroom production or other types of crops that can be grown more in that shade environment. It can also include, forest farming can also include food forests that we talk about that can be permaculture types of plantings that include multi-story types of systems. And then alley cropping is another one, and I'll talk a little bit more if you want to go a slide back. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so an alley cropping system is a little bit unusual in that you're actually planting the trees and shrubs in rows and then planting crops in between those rows. So one of the options that we're looking at, we're calling agroforestry for food, and the idea of it is it's going to mimic a savanna ecosystem. So savannas were native to this area, so that's a good kind of model for our system. And so we're really interested in kind of replacing the functions that our current landscape provides. So corn would provide starch, and so we're looking at chestnut as being an alternative to that. And soybean would provide an oil base, and so we're looking at hazelnut as a replacement for that. And then we're also incorporating a lot of other crops within that system. And then the other thing, so that's kind of the production end of it. And so I talked about my research really focusing on multifunctional landscapes. And so the production aspect is one, but we're really also interested in other types of ecosystem services. So the environmental benefits provided by agroforestry are huge because you get conserving biodiversity, you get carbon sequestration, a lot of water quality benefits, stabilizing the soil, cycling nutrients, those types of things. And one thing we often don't think about, particularly in the U.S., is the potential for agricultural landscapes to to provide cultural functions. And so integrating trees and shrubs into the landscape can also improve the visual quality, provide recreational opportunities, like you think about hunting or hiking in an agricultural landscape. If you have forested areas, it's a lot more pleasant environment to do recreational activities. So yeah, this image that we're showing right now really shows a lot of those ecological benefits that agroforestry systems can provide. And this is one of the systems, kind of shows the design of one of the options that we've looked at, where you could take a windbreak program where you have rows of trees and shrubs, but instead of just using any old trees or shrubs, we can use ones that produce trees that produce nuts, and a lot of shrubs that produce edible berries. And so you're adding even another kind of economic element to it. That's good. Yeah. Okay, that slide shows some of the species that we're actually looking at mixed into our system. And these guys have also worked on similar types of approaches. And so I think what's unique about the systems that we're talking about jointly is that they do have this food aspect to them, and it's not kind of separating the conservation from the agriculture. We're looking at a conservation system that can actually provide a production function as well.
Okay, so we know all of we have a bunch of great benefits: environmental services, potential for diverse products and diversifying the farm, which I think is very important. So why not? Why don't we see this? And maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Paulson. If you want to maybe talk on, I'm interested on that economic side of what makes things like this so difficult to just start.
We always start with the economists. We want the negative.
Yeah. You can end on a positive.
No, that's been my job on some of these projects, is to be the damper on the party. But so I think in terms of challenges, I think there's a few big. I would say, I don't know if systemic is the right word, but regardless of the specific economic environment that we're in, I think a couple of the challenges that we face in terms of agroforestry versus what we currently have as a landscape, particularly in Illinois, is it'd be moving from an annual, in most cases, an annual cropping system to a multi-year perennial system, which requires fairly significant investment and kind of a different set of resources, much more labor-intensive, rather than the capital-intensive annual production systems that we currently have with corn and soybeans. So a big upfront investment in time and finances with a delay in payoff. And that's a challenge in any environment, and I think right now in particular, the downturn that we're in, on the one hand, nobody's making any money growing corn and soybeans, but they also don't have any money to invest in anything new, any major shift in their production system. Also, it's different, and change is challenging. So these systems we don't know a lot about. I think that shows the importance of the research that's going into that to provide the education to producers moving forward and hopefully help to make that transition easier. Another big issue we have is just the way that land is controlled, the land that's used for ag production, how it's controlled. And the majority of land that is used for production is done so under a rental agreement. So the landowner is not actually the active farmer involved in production. And the majority of those rental contracts are cash rent contracts. They're not even, we're moving away from share rent contracts where the landowner was involved in some way to cash rent contracts that may only be 1 year, 2 year, 3 years in length, which makes it a challenge to implement some of these much longer term production systems on a large scale. So I think those are a few of the challenges we face.
Well, thanks for being such a downer. But I don't, that's where the conversation shouldn't end, right? And so I want to, maybe Scott, you can lead with this of given those opportunities and knowing, the environmental impact it can have, how we can start to diversify our farms, conserve our natural resources. But given those challenges, why did you choose to plant this type of system?
Well, the major attraction to us was sustainability and long-term stewardship of the land. all of these elements that we've talked about here are integral to it and important. We grew up with a family mission of leaving the land in better condition than you started, and we know that America is feeding more people and succeeding with the corn and soybean model, and we've still got a lot of that going on. But we wanted to try to do something that might make it more attractive and long-term appealing to future generations. And in order to see how that might work, we had to start somewhere. So out of 425 acres, we took 17 and set them aside. But I'll tell you, those 17 acres have proven to be very, very rewarding and time-consuming. But the mission was to get into something, plant something, if you will, that would begin to show us what we might do, not from a fear motivation, but if something should happen, if a blight should occur to the soybeans in this country, and all of a sudden there weren't any, what would people be growing and eating and living off of? And there aren't a lot of models in place experimenting with that. We were introduced to the Savannah Institute and got excited about trying this at this level at this time.
Will and Bill, I want to ask about, Bill, what has been your experience in extension and, getting this type of information? I know you work in many different diverse cropping systems and trying to help farmers that are interested in those. What has been your, what have you seen throughout Central Illinois in terms of interest in this? And what are those concerns or questions from farmers?
So there is a lot of interest in it, but it is a new crop when you talk about chestnuts or hazelnuts. So there is some hesitation over the long-term nature of the crop and how to make it work. So that's primarily what we're working towards. So looking at things like the tree and nut crops are part of a system. So what can you do to manage your farm to bridge that gap between when you plant the trees and they start producing? So there are lots of opportunities with pasture and hay, like alley cropping in between, where you can generate annual income in the years leading up to getting your trees and shrubs to produce. So basically what you're doing is building up your capacity to stack up enterprises on a given piece of land, and then your income just can increase dramatically to the point where you're not dependent on any one component of the system. Like now, people are very much dependent on 2 annual crops. If you stack up 5 or 6 enterprises that are all generating profit on your land, you have a lot more flexibility. So that's what we're trying to get to. We're thinking about things like poultry. People can generate annual sales and income from poultry that can graze in the alleys, and then you can continue to grow your annual crops in alleys, so you can space the trees out. They're small, they're not casting a lot of shade for the first few years, so you can continue with your cropping system and then sort of phase into more diversity over time.
Will, coming from a family that has some history and some organic and diverse cropping methods, what do you see? Do you have any type of system like this planted yet? If not, is it in your plan? What do you see as the opportunities and challenges on your farm?
Yeah, so, I mean, like a lot of farmers, I think on our operation, we're notoriously greedy and kind of lazy. So we're looking at the way we can maximize our money with the least amount of effort. And we don't want to really change our cropping system a whole lot. We still want to raise our corn and our soybeans and our wheat and our cattle. So rather, I've talked to the Savannah Institute, and they focus on the trees as the crop, and then in their alley cropping system, and then the grain in between would be a secondary crop. And I'm going the opposite. I want to focus on the grain as my primary crop, but around my field borders, that'll be my secondary crop of trees. It's already sitting there in a fence. It's got grass growing. I got to mow it. And if I can put some kind of chestnut or some other crop that I could harvest, maybe timber or fruit, with some asparagus, or other kind of vegetable, perennial vegetable in the understory, I can add value to something that's already there. And, you know, once I plant it, that takes a little bit of time, to plant it. But if we look at chestnuts, for example, I can take a little nut picker-upper after the crop's harvested and the nuts fall and run that over the ground, pick it up, and now I've got I don't have a whole lot of work, but now I just added one more crop.
So maybe it's a question to all of you, whoever wants to give some input, but, you know, back to maybe some of these opportunities in terms of crops, you know, how do these types of berries, fruits, nuts, does anybody have a forecast on maybe where you could go with these and, you know, the actual market potential of, say, chestnuts and corn, or hazelnuts? You touched on it a little bit with the, you know, chestnut as corn, hazelnut as soy. Some more on that, maybe?
We've had initial success, and it's surprised us. This is where some of the work I referred to came in. Blackberries, black raspberries, and currants came in almost really. Well, the first year after planting, we had a few. The second year, we had 300 pounds of blackberries, and no. Well, I'll tell you. Do we have time for an entertaining story?
You got 1 minute.
I met a lady who's a chef who lives in Iowa, in the only town in Iowa that has a distillery, a brewery, and a winery. And she said she'd be interested in some of this local produce. So when we got black raspberries, I got like 10 pounds first year. And I went to her and I said, could you use these? And she said, yeah. She called me in a month and she said, I want you to see what we've done with those. We infused some of our vodka with this, and here's a sample. Oh my golly, is that stuff? It's a beautiful purple color. It tastes and smells wonderful. It's a beautiful vodka that they distill. And she said, and we want your crop. I thought, holy cow, my first year, I don't know how. She said, as soon as you can produce a ton at a time, we'll take it. Remember, I had 10 pounds. And I actually said, Jesus Christ couldn't turn this crop into a ton. So we're never going to have that happen. I ended up going home and infusing some vodka for my friends for Christmas presents.
I'm also thinking towards alcohol. Again, chestnut as one of the options, and there's many, or oak we can use for staves or for wood barrels. But if we look at chestnuts, we can take our top tier and sell that as direct food for human consumption. We can take the middle tier and grind that up and distill it. My plan is to have a chestnut whiskey. And then you can take the bottom tier and feed it to livestock. So we also run hogs. So we try to diversify horizontally as well as vertically on our markets and different operations.
And I'll take a pivot away from the alcohol because we tried aronia berry with vodka infusing. No, not good at all. So, but aronia berry and elderberry are a couple of fruit crops that we've had really, really good luck with in multiple environments. So we have them planted in one of our treatments as an alley crop, but they've also done pretty well in like a riparian zone. So when we talk about taking marginal land and putting it into these types of systems, these could be well adapted to that environment. So not good with alcohol, but they have super high antioxidants, so they're really good for human health benefits. And so aronia berry is also called chokeberry for a reason. It's not great to eat straight, but if you freeze it and mix it in with other fruits in a smoothie or something like that, it can be really good, and it gives it nice, deep, complex flavor, and the color, purple color, is amazing. So there's some good opportunities there. And just grinding it up and going into some of the markets for like nutraceutical types of applications.
So I'd like maybe each of you to take a stab at this. And, you know, I constantly have the challenge myself of, you know, we a lot of these conversations in good food movement and local foods, we tend to talk about small farming or getting more, you know, beginning farmers, direct to market. These are all great things. And then say on the EDC level, I get consumed in thinking of industrial agriculture and its role in this, the international food supply chain. And here in the Midwest, we have this immense agricultural asset, and we tend to not connect the dots between what that big industrial ag means and how it ties to that local regional food system. And as we develop those supply chains, everywhere from production to consumer, what role does agroforestry or these types of practices play on a large scale? And in your opinion, what role does that large-scale agriculture play in the development of regional food systems? And how might agroforestry play a role in that and connecting those dots? Because we have food forests,
Maybe to redeem myself a little bit. I actually think that industrial scale that we have in our current corn-soybean rotation, let's call it, and the barriers to entry that it creates for some of the younger folks who want to come back into agriculture, I think that's actually an asset or a benefit for things like agroforestry systems. So, in the 10 years I've been at the university, I can think of half a dozen or more kind of cool student success stories of students I had come through my classroom or in clubs that I work with that, maybe there was multiple siblings and they were going back to a farm that was maybe 1,000 acres that, was fine if it was, with mom and dad operating it, but you got 2 or 3 brothers and sisters, and now all of a sudden it doesn't really become enough to sustain 3 or 4 families. And this is a way, like Will's talking about, in terms of not necessarily expanding the farm, but making it more efficient and extracting more value out of the land that you have, because it just isn't feasible to expand within that industrial scale system. So, there's again, I can think of at least half a dozen students who I know have gone through and actually gone more in this direction than in the industrial scale direction for that exact reason.
Bill, I know, we've had conversations that, how are you working and how do you see it of things like agroforestry on a larger scale, if it's possible to scale these systems up? How does that play into the regional food system and the regional value chain that we're all talking about creating?
Well, the way I think about beginning is just trying to demonstrate the viability of the concept, and then working with farm families that, like Dr. Paulson described, they might own thousands of acres of land that are kind of already in the system, one way of doing it, but you can pull off, 80 acres, 120 acres, and then that becomes the laboratory or the way to experiment for the next generation to come back to the farm to do something a little different. So if we have all these farms out there that are managing thousands of acres and then they intensify at a small scale, we collectively can get to the point where we begin to build a regional system based off those acres, and we become more efficient and we can share resources and move to the more cooperative model where we develop markets and the region could become known for other crops, other products that are developed from them. So that's how I think about it.
Another way to think about it is imagine all of the years of breeding and all of the dollars of industry money that's gone into improving corn and soybeans. And so just imagine if just a fraction of that funding and commitment would have gone into tree crops like what we're talking about. So we're just kind of in the early stages of really improving these crops, so there's a lot of potential to improve those. And it's kind of like a thing where we need to get systems out there on the ground so that we can start understanding more about how they work. And maybe if we get those out even just on marginal lands now, then maybe those will be kind of the nodes for diffusion of that concept into the broader landscape a little bit.
I think it's important to play in all markets. I think we should take as much as we can and direct market that locally, but then any kind of surplus, we should be able to move that into a higher volume, lower margin market.
Before we get into questions from everybody, just one last question if whoever wants to comment on it. If if I am an interested farmer or landowner, where do I start with this? Because this could be big. It could be as big as, just jumping in and planting acres and acres of it, or it could be starting with a windbreak, a productive windbreaker, creating a riparian buffer. So whoever wants to comment on maybe what are those steps you can start taking if you want to explore this?
Well, in our case, we started with the co-sponsor of this seminar, the Savannah Institute, and had, the affiliation there through the University of Illinois and their college, and working together over a year, developed a plan, identified the acres, and we took our least productive traditional farming acres and set aside that area, that space for what we decided we were wanting to try to grow, what should do well in our region, and what we were interested in growing, what we thought would be fun to have. And that plan, we couldn't have done that ourselves, and we had the advice and the expertise from there, and also a connection to a company that would help us actually plant these 22,000 little sticks like this. I would highly recommend that anybody that's interested contact the Savannah Institute. They're cutting edge kind of in that. They're members all over the country now.
Yeah, so I think for farmers, I think what they can do is look at their yield maps from year to year and identify those areas that are really less productive. Because there are certain areas almost for any grower that are barely even breaking even, and sometimes in the negative because of all the inputs that go in. So identifying those areas is a good start, and then starting to transition those areas into something that's more perennial. And then we do have quite a few resources. So I have the Agroforestry for Food page, but then there are 2 documents, free resources here. They're really nice guidebooks. The one, Multifunctional Perennial Cropping Systems, that's more about the planning and everything that goes into the process. That one's available for download. And then we, with one of my grad students, combined with Savannah Institute, have this Planting Tree Crops guidebook that talks really about the details of how to establish and maintain these types of systems. So I think those are really useful resources for anybody who's really committed to trying this out.
Any other comments from the panel before we start taking questions?
I run a learning community called the Idea Farm Network, and that's it's a free resource for anyone that's interested. It's a listserv, and a lot of people share ideas and questions on there. We try to have about 1 meeting a month, and a couple months ago it was on cropping tree crops.
Very cool. Okay, well, I guess we can open up to questions. I'm going to attempt to field questions from folks online as well. I'm giving them the slide here with everyone's faces in case they want to direct questions specifically. Somehow I have to figure out how to get back here. Any out there?
Yeah, has any research been done or anybody looked into the use of chestnuts or hazelnuts as a animal feedstock, specifically on rates and gains and flavor profiles that might impart on the critter that's eating it? Has anybody started any type of preliminary research on you're talking about corn and soybeans being comparable in their chemical composition, possibly to these products, functionality-wise? Has that research started with some of the stuff that's being produced?
So there are a few people who've done feeding hogs on hazelnuts, and it's more kind of a pork meat quality kind of thing that they're looking at. And the other benefit of doing that is that the hogs can basically just eat the material right off the ground, so they can get into the nut without having to do any processing. Not so much with chestnuts because they're such a high value product, but another one is acorns actually. So there are some studies looking at hogs being fed on acorns, which is another opportunity for improving kind of the quality of the meat and having a tree crop that grows well in our region.
So I totally see the benefits of the agroforestry, like silvopasture model, and I understand the outlay of capital needed and the amount of labor that goes into maintaining the rows and caring for the trees when they're in the sapling age until they produce canopy. Where can we look for a profitable model that's been privately funded example of this in the United States or even in the world? Because I can't find any personally.
So we're so early in this whole system that we are only projecting at this point on what things would look like at in a more mature stand. And so we can kind of estimate what the yields would be at the mature stage and get a sense of where the profitability would be if you have mixed cropping systems. So it makes a better case if you have a mix of like chestnuts with berry crops growing in between them and an alley crop in between those, which could be a high value vegetable production or system or something like that. In terms of internationally, in places like France, they've done a lot of work with alley cropping systems, more looking at timber crops, but they have done that very profitably, like looking at black walnut as a timber product in with different small grain options. And so it can be profitable, certainly in other countries. Here it is a little bit difficult because of the way our incentive systems are set up, and with insurance, crop insurance and things like that, it makes it a higher barrier, I think, for us in the U.S. And so kind of looking at those other values, and if we can start to add in monetary values to the other like environmental benefits that these systems provide, then we can start to maybe look at something that's quite profitable.
And it would make a lot more sense for a farmer who owned land to dabble in some of this than to think about doing it with land acquisition costs as one of your initial expenses. I don't know of a model that proves that that's going to be profitable soon.
I haven't made any money doing it yet, but it's a really low investment. My brother and I in the fall will grab the four-wheeler and a couple beers and a nut basket and go walking through the woods and picking up a bunch of nuts. And then kind of depending on how we're feeling, we either just scatter the nuts or we'll dig a hole and just bury the nuts. So really low investment. And the success rate isn't very high, but I have had some trees grow. So.
We have one from online here. It's more of a comment, but I think it's a good question. Maybe someone can talk about one of the challenges of planting a new crop, hazelnuts or pawpaws, for example, is the lack of local infrastructure to get the produce to market. So what type of activity might be going on in that and developing those markets for some of these new crops?
I hear rumors of cooperatives wanting to start among farmers who are growing hazelnuts, that there could be then a collective benefit, but I'm not plugged into any of those.
I guess one successful example would be with the Ronia, which I was talking about earlier, Ronia berry. So there is a cooperative group in Iowa there's one area where they've basically found the market first and then kind of brought in different farmers, and so they're kind of sharing equipment, so not every farmer has to have a berry harvester, and they're sharing knowledge like on the irrigation systems and things like that. So I think it's a good model to follow, but it's kind of a chicken and egg thing for sure. Like, we need the markets to get the growers, but we need the crops to get the markets, so there's certainly challenges for sure.
Excuse me, I've got a question you kind of touched on already, but I'll take it just a little different angle. What about, we have a lot of programs out there for conservation, set-aside acres. Obviously, this would be a production crop. You also have programs out there for farmer veterans, for folks who are trying to get started in farming. would any of this be possible if you had a small piece of land that you had access to, whether it be 5 acres or 10 acres? You know, specialty crops that is a higher value than the traditional row crops. Would there be any programs out there that somebody who had access to that wanted to get started in that could get grants or loans based on this, or is it still in its infancy so much that wouldn't be possible?
The acres that we planted, we surrounded with a windbreak of hazelnuts, evergreens, fast-growing poplar trees. And one of the reasons we did that was to have things around the perimeter to hopefully discourage deer from going further into our more valuable plants. After we did this, we learned that there had been CRP project money for building windbreaks. And what we did would have constituted a windbreak easily under their definition. And we ended up, you know, with the hazelnuts in there, and you could also have elderberries and other shrubs that would qualify as part of the hazelnut, but as part of the windbreak, but would also produce food and a profitable item for you.
Yeah, so for something like the Conservation Reserve Program, you can't sell the products off of that. But if you do look at the windbreak program design, you're basically doing a row of deciduous trees, a row of shrubs, maybe a row of those mixed together, and a row of evergreens. So we've designed systems actually that have a lot of diversity in native species. So they have pecan and persimmon and walnut, a lot of species that have both a food product, and there are tons of berry crops. So aronia and elderberry are both native to our area, but there are a lot of options there. So you can plant those in the windbreak program. You can't sell off of it during the period it's in the program, but then when the lease is up on that, now you have somewhat mature system at that point. So maybe instead of farmers, once they're out of the program, ripping out whatever they just established, now they have a pretty profitable area that they might at that time retain. So basically the program can pay you to get up to a more mature system. So that's one option that we're looking at.
Online here, Savannah Institute mentioned USDA has many grants and funding opportunities supporting agroforestry practices. I'm not sure if it's quite what you're looking for, but I think that's a good thought that those types of programs should be developed with beginning farmer programs. There was a nutshell, she said, for Savannah Institute that's on the YouTube page that talks a little bit more about these programs. Also, a participant online had a comment, I believe, to an earlier question. There is an existing chestnut growers cooperative in Iowa, and many examples of chestnut growers earning a good income from them. So maybe something to look into for some of those opportunities.
I was just listening. Most of the comments and things were starting new. What if you got existing, you know, big oaks, some walnuts? Do your processes change, or do you still maintain the same? How do I work with that as opposed to converting land? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're talking about where you have just kind of like a savanna type of planting.
I've got a black
like
oak
that.
savanna, and then I've got a whole bunch of pin oaks, and I've got a section of walnut that are all fairly mature.
So there are buyers for walnuts and other nut crops that are just gathered like that. Now they're typically not improved varieties, so the price for those is going to be substantially lower. But the other thing is you can look at that as kind of your canopy layer, and then underneath there you can do lots of things. There are some of our berry shrubs would be shade tolerant enough that they could grow in that understory environment. So you could interplant something like pawpaws, or even some of the June berries might work well in that environment. So you could link those in. You can also look at the adding in livestock option. So if it's more of an open grove of trees, integrating livestock into that could be an option.
More questions out there? There we go.
With the alley farming, have you had any success stories with livestock, such as cattle in those, or what were they using, or what combination?
I have not done it, but I know that it's one of the promoted possibilities.
We haven't put livestock into our research plots. We could, because it's actually, we're just doing pastured hay in there. But we don't want to risk any damage to the trees being so young in research plots. But in theory, if you fenced off everything, you could run grazing livestock through there. But another system that we've seen growing in interest is poultry. So doing pastured poultry in between like mixes of hazelnuts and elderberries. And so that's one system that shows a lot of promise, I think, and less likelihood for damage while the materials are pretty small.
We had to fence off our young oaks because the cows really liked them. But we're hoping in a few years they'll get big enough that we won't have to. Plus, we didn't use any tree tubes, and I'm kind of thinking for anything that we plant bare root from here on out around cattle, we'll have to put tree tubes on them.
Are you doing any research into like equipment that would be useful in these systems? I'm just thinking like mechanized vegetable harvesting equipment is probably, or things that are used in larger production systems. Might be premature, but
yeah. So so I guess the first step is getting things planted. So we are using vegetable transplanters that are also used for vegetables to plant bare-rooted trees, and so a number of us have done that actually on our properties. But in terms of harvesting, so the labor piece is a big one. We did get a harvester that works in, it's a berry harvester that kind of harvests on the side, so it does work in our systems where we have a mix of trees and shrubs, as long as we have a section of shrubs that's long enough. So like to make it work well, probably 15 feet of shrubs in between the trees, which is a pretty good distance for tree planting anyway. So this particular harvester, yeah, it basically goes on the side. It can move around each of the trees. And so we did our first harvest of black currants with that this year, and it actually worked a lot better than we thought. So, but we're still kind of learning, so it's definitely, early on the learning curve with that.
I'll say, too, I like that question because at the EDC, those are the types of questions that we like to entertain, especially when we're talking about the development of a supply chain, and especially in the greater Peoria region, given our manufacturing base, too, of, if we really as a region started to explore these new cropping systems, then exactly that, do we have opportunity here to manufacture some of that equipment that might need to be created or, implements to retrofit machinery that we have. In terms of research, we've even talked in the region, and this is future looking, but is there an opportunity to develop some of those sites that might be more of a, say, a farm makerspace type thing that could, blend the great research happening at the land grant institutions with some ag tech folks or manufacturers to create some of those solutions, because that's where another opportunity for creating businesses exists.
Yeah, a lot of our equipment ideas come from Europe, not from here. Yeah, like our berry harvester would have been I don't know if it was originally designed in Europe, in Germany, or that's where a lot of equipment comes from. But like also with the hazelnuts, we can use basic hazelnut harvesting equipment, because basically hazelnuts just fall to the ground, and then they're like vacuum machines that vacuum them up off the ground. So as long as you can get whatever's on the understory mown down low enough, you can just use the basic equipment that's already being used, but not so much in the U.S., more in places like France and in Italy.
We have a couple from online. Has University of Illinois, or I guess I'd say if anybody knows anyone that has developed any calculators to help determine startup costs versus time to pay out for agroforestry projects?
One aspect of the project I'm involved with Sarah on, that long-term project, I guess. to be continued on that?
Stay tuned.
Yeah, I mean, we're tracking everything. So right now, we're still in the early stages. We're still like just 3 years in or whatever, but we're tracking all of the inputs, including all the labor time that we spend on that, so that we are able to put numbers on that ultimately. But again, we're not to the point on any of the nut trees that we're close to them providing a return. So it's a long-term story, I guess.
Another online, I have heard that alley cropping in between certain trees in Mediterranean climate is more productive, profitable than having them in separate monocultures. Does anyone have any comment in Illinois, in central Illinois, of this being true? So I guess mingling these crops as opposed to separate monocultures, is there?
We don't have data on that from Illinois. I visited some of the sites in France where they have shown that growing these together is more profitable. You get more overall yield than you would growing them separately. And most of the information from more of the ecology area, talking about just productivity of plants when they're grown in mixed systems, suggests that we would see a greater benefit of having things in mixed systems than grown separately. The challenge then is still just managing it. So the more diversity, the better, kind of in terms of ecological productivity. But when you're managing it and trying to deal with equipment, there's some maybe trade-off there that you're having to deal with.
Any more questions out there? Well, I guess I had one more then, or maybe it's not, maybe last comments from each of you, and I think, just to bring it back around to why this is even important to the conversation, to regional foods, to agriculture at large. Why are these discussions even happening around agroforestry? And maybe just your last thoughts on, the future of these practices.
I think the practice gives us an opportunity to diversify, and for all the reasons that makes sense, economically, environmentally, philosophically. Why not try new and different things? That's what most of the display tables and all here at this conference are about, is people who are trying to approach this feeding more people better from various perspectives, and whether it's alley cropping or trees in the pasture, all these things are worth trying. It's true, we don't have the data right now to say we can prove without a doubt that this works better than that, but it isn't hurting us a bit to try these things.
So I guess, again, coming into this with my background more in the traditional industrial scale side of things, that's my experience. I just think there's a lot of factors at play here that are pushing us towards systems like agroforestry, and I don't necessarily view agroforestry as like the solution necessarily. I think it's part of a portfolio of solutions to address some of the issues that we face in ag in general right now. I think I mentioned at the outset of this discussion that the reason I'm working in this area now is that the intersection of ag and conservation and ecosystem services and environmental issues is becoming more and more important. And I think there is an interest from producers in land stewardship and providing those things regardless of the economics behind it. But I think there's also the recognition that producers need to be proactive on some of these environmental issues, because moving forward, I think, from a policy perspective or a regulatory perspective, something needs to be done. And the more ahead of the issue that producers can be, the better. So, whether it's agroforestry or cover crops or some of the other systems that we can work into what's currently being done, I think all of these things are going to work together to improve what we're doing in ag.
So I think there's tremendous momentum towards building regenerative systems. Agroforestry is a tool for that, and it's a way to cover the soil, which is really what it comes down to in the end, and what we need to do is find a way to produce food and keep the soil covered, because most of our problems come from large monocultures that are tilled annually. So it gives us a tool and an opportunity to do that, and there are very compelling stories from around the country, around the world, of farmers that have done this, that basically create a more resilient farm. You build up, you cover your soil, you begin to build organic matter, that is sort of becomes your money in the bank and your safety net that makes your farm more resilient and more profitable. So Gabe Brown is someone with a great story. Many other people are doing that. So it's coming. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of finding a way to speed it up and help it happen here.
I think it's just agroforestry is one way that we can find niches in unused areas and overall make the farm more efficient and more profitable. I mean, I know a guy who touts himself that he can raise 260 bushel corn and combine it in a minute and a half. They have a 5-acre golf course for a yard. I mean, if the guy got some sheep, he could mow his yard and raise some meat at the same time. So I think this is just one way that we can keep overall getting better without having to get bigger.
All right. Well, thank you all. Are there any last questions from the crowd before we wrap this up here? I think we're like right at time.
Well done.
So, all right, thank you all, and thank you to this wonderful panel. If anybody wanted to share this panel with their friends or farmers that might be interested, the Savannah Institute, I believe this will be available on their website and or their YouTube channel, one of the two. All of their Nutshell series are. So thank you again, and thank you to the Illinois Farm Bureau.